The forest was alive. Leaves rustled overhead, and branches creaked in the breeze, filling the air with an uneasy hum. Travis Dalton wiped the sweat from his brow, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He adjusted the straps of his worn backpack and pushed forward, weaving through the thick underbrush. The fading light filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. He wasn't supposed to be here, at least not according to the rules of his parole. He had been warned to stay clear of trouble, but trouble always seemed to find him, no matter how far he ran. The wilderness was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place to clear his head and avoid people. Yet, as he pressed deeper into the woods, something gnawed at him, an unease he couldn't shake. The distant cry of a baby pierced the stillness. Travis froze. The sound came again, sharp, desperate. He turned in a slow circle, straining to locate the source. His pulse quickened. It couldn't be real. No one left a baby out here. Not in a place like this. The crying grew louder, more frantic. Travis's feet moved before his brain could catch up. He broke into a jog, ducking under low branches and sidestepping roots that jutted from the ground like skeletal fingers. The noise pulled him forward, past moss-covered rocks and fallen logs, until he stumbled into a small clearing. There, in the center, lay a bundle wrapped in a tattered blanket. Travis's breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, half expecting the scene to dissolve like a mirage, but the baby was real, small, red-faced, and wailing. Then he saw it. A massive snake was coiled around the infant. Travis staggered back, his heart hammering. The snake's body gleamed with scales that caught the fading sunlight, and its head rested just inches away from the baby's face. The creature didn't move, but its presence radiated danger. Panic clawed at his chest. He couldn't leave the baby, but he also couldn't fight something like this barehanded. He scanned the clearing, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His eyes landed on a thick branch nearby. Slowly, he bent down and grabbed it, careful not to make sudden movements. "Hey," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Easy now." The snake's head lifted slightly, its eyes locking onto him. Travis's mind raced. Snakes didn't act this way, not unless they were protecting something. Was the baby food? Or was there something more sinister at play? He didn't have time to figure it out. In one swift motion, Travis swung the branch, aiming to startle the snake rather than hurt it. The snake hissed, uncoiling just enough for Travis to lunge forward. He snatched the baby, stumbling backward as the reptile slithered away into the underbrush. The baby's cries echoed through the clearing, but Travis barely noticed. His arms trembled as he cradled the child, scanning the area for signs of more danger. "Shoo, it's okay," he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. The baby quieted slightly, clinging to him with tiny fingers. Travis felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on his chest. This wasn't just a random discovery. There was no way this child had ended up here by accident. He pulled back the edge of the blanket, revealing a small pendant hanging around the baby's neck. The symbol engraved on it was unfamiliar, an intricate spiral pattern that seemed both ancient and deliberate. Travis swallowed hard. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The shadows in the forest seemed darker now, stretching toward him like grasping hands. He turned and hurried back the way he had come, his footsteps quick and uneven. Every sound, every crack of a twig, sent his nerves into overdrive. When he finally reached the edge of the clearing, he paused, looking down at the child in his arms. "Looks like it's just you and me now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as the baby settled against his chest, Travis couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Travis moved quickly, weaving through the trees as if something, or someone, might be following him. The baby had fallen asleep against his chest, but every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made him flinch. The forest felt alive, not in the peaceful way he had once imagined it, but in a way that made his skin crawl. He couldn't tell if the shadows playing along the trunks of the trees were just tricks of light or something darker. Reaching a fallen log, Travis knelt and carefully set the baby down on a patch of moss. His hands trembled as he pulled the tattered blanket tighter around the child's tiny body. He needed to think, needed a plan. Food. Shelter. Safety. He opened his backpack and rifled through it, pulling out half a granola bar and a bottle of water. It wasn't much. He wasn't prepared for this. Heck, he hadn't been prepared for anything in years. Stay calm, he muttered to himself, though his voice was strained. The baby stirred, whimpering softly. Travis instinctively reached out, brushing the child's cheek with his thumb. It was softer than he expected, fragile in a way that made his chest tighten. "It's okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if the words were meant for the baby or for himself. He took a sip of water and carefully dripped a few drops onto the baby's lips. The child responded instantly, mouth opening as if instinctively reaching for more. Travis fed it tiny sips, unsure if he was doing it right but too afraid to stop. Minutes stretched into an hour as he tried to calm his racing thoughts. Why would someone leave a baby out here? And that snake, it hadn't attacked. It had almost seemed like it was guarding the child. Travis shook his head. He couldn't focus on questions he couldn't answer, not now. Instead, he grabbed his knife and began gathering branches and leaves to make a shelter. His movements were sharp and deliberate, driven by a need to keep busy. The small lean-to wasn't much, but it provided cover from the elements and some sense of security. Night fell quickly. The temperature dropped, and the forest grew darker, quieter. Travis held the baby close, trying to keep it warm with his body heat. "You've got to hang in there," he whispered, rocking the child gently. "I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm not letting anything happen to you." The baby made a soft cooing sound, and for the first time since finding it, Travis felt something other than panic, hope. But the feeling didn't last. A noise, low and deliberate, echoed through the trees. Travis stiffened, his muscles tensing. It wasn't an animal. It sounded too deliberate. Footsteps? He crouched lower, pulling the baby closer as his eyes darted toward the darkness. He strained to hear more, but the sound faded. Was someone out there? Watching? Travis gritted his teeth. He couldn't let fear control him. He grabbed a thick branch and held it tight, ready to defend himself if he had to. The night dragged on. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. By morning, his eyes burned, and his body ached, but the baby was still safe. That was all that mattered. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, Travis finally allowed himself to breathe. He needed to move, needed to find answers. But as he shifted, something caught his eye. There, near the edge of the clearing, was a footprint. Not an animal's. A man's. And it was fresh. Travis's breath hitched as he stared at the footprint pressed into the soft earth. It was deep, fresh, and unmistakably human. His eyes darted around the clearing, searching for movement, but the forest was still, too still. He crouched beside the mark, brushing his fingers over its edges. The print was larger than his own, and the depth suggested someone heavy, possibly carrying gear. Whoever it was, they hadn't been here long. Travis stood, instinctively pulling the baby closer. The child stirred in his arms, whimpering softly as if sensing his unease. "It's okay," Travis whispered, though the words felt hollow. "I've got you." His gaze shifted to the pendant around the baby's neck. The spiral symbol carved into it seemed to shimmer faintly in the morning light, as if it held secrets he couldn't yet grasp. He ran his thumb over the smooth surface, tracing the design. It felt deliberate, important. Travis turned the pendant over, searching for more clues. The back was engraved with faint lines that formed a pattern he didn't recognize, almost like a map or coordinates. "Who are you?" he murmured, staring at the baby's peaceful face. A twig snapped behind him. Travis spun around, heart hammering. The clearing was empty, but the sound had been real, too close to be imagined. He needed to move. Gathering his things, he carefully tucked the pendant beneath the baby's blanket and hoisted the child into his arms. Every instinct told him to keep going, but his mind screamed questions he couldn't silence. Why was the baby out here? Who did the pendant belong to? And what if the person who left that footprint was coming back? Travis pushed forward, moving deeper into the forest. He avoided trails and open spaces, sticking to dense brush where he could stay hidden. His legs burned, but he didn't stop. Hours passed, and the forest began to thin. He stumbled into a clearing near a river, its banks lined with smooth stones. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and for the first time, Travis felt a flicker of relief. But it didn't last. As he knelt to refill his water bottle, something caught his eye, a torn scrap of fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. It was stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. His stomach tightened. He unwrapped the baby slightly, checking for injuries he might have missed, but the child was unharmed. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. He turned the fabric over in his hands. It didn't match the baby's blanket. Someone else had been here, and they'd been hurt. A sharp cry echoed through the trees. Travis jerked his head up, scanning the area. It wasn't the baby. The sound was distant, but close enough to set his nerves on edge. Gripping his knife, he crept toward the noise, leaving the baby swaddled safely in the blanket near the river's edge. He hated leaving it even for a second, but he couldn't risk walking into danger with the child in his arms. As he approached a cluster of rocks, the cries grew louder. He rounded the corner and froze. A woman. She was lying at the base of the rocks, her leg bent at an unnatural angle and her face streaked with dirt and blood. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Help me," she rasped, her voice raw. Travis hesitated, his instincts warring with logic. He didn't know her, didn't trust her, but he couldn't leave her. "Who are you?" he demanded, keeping his knife low but ready. "Sarah," she gasped. I was looking for him. The baby." Travis's blood ran cold. "How do you know about the baby?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Because he's not safe. None of us are." Travis tightened his grip on the knife. "Start talking," he demanded, his voice low but sharp. Sarah winced, her hand clutching her injured leg. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I'll explain everything, but I need your help first." Travis hesitated. Every instinct told him to be cautious, but the desperation in her voice felt too real to ignore. He knelt beside her, scanning the jagged rocks that had clearly caused her injury. "This is gonna hurt," he said, reaching for her leg. Sarah clenched her teeth as he straightened it, then used strips of his shirt to create a makeshift splint. She let out a pained groan, but when it was done, her breathing slowed. "Okay," Travis said, backing up. "Now talk." Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the forest. "That baby, he's part of something bigger than either of us." Travis's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's not just any child. He was taken from a group of people who believe he's sacred. That pendant around his neck? It's a symbol they use to mark their own." Travis's stomach sank. He glanced back toward the river where he'd left the baby, suddenly anxious. "And the snake?" "It wasn't attacking him," Sarah said quickly. "It was protecting him. The people who left him out here, they believe the snake is a guardian. Part of some ancient ritual." Travis ran a hand through his hair, trying to process. "So you're saying they just left him out here as, what? Some kind of offering?" Sarah shook her head. "No. More like a test. If he survived the night, they'd take it as a sign that he was chosen." Travis felt a chill run down his spine. "And if he didn't? They'd say he wasn't worthy." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He thought of the tiny, helpless child he had found and the snake coiled protectively around it. It all sounded insane, but deep down, it made a disturbing kind of sense. "Why were you looking for him?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, then met his eyes. "Because I was trying to stop them." Travis studied her, searching for any signs of a lie, but all he saw was exhaustion and pain. "Do they know he's alive?" he asked. Sarah nodded. and they won't stop until they get him back. Travis's pulse quickened. We need to move. He stood and helped Sarah to her feet. She winced but stayed steady, leaning on him for support. Together, they made their way back to the river. When Travis saw the baby still bundled safely in the blanket, relief flooded through him. He scooped the child into his arms, holding it tightly. We can't stay out here, Sarah said, her voice urgent. There's a cabin about a mile from here, old, abandoned. We can rest there and figure out what to do next. Travis nodded. Lead the way. The journey was slow. Sarah's injury forced them to stop several times, and Travis kept one eye on the shadows, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerge from the trees. When they finally reached the cabin, Travis felt his shoulders relax just slightly. The structure was small and weathered, but it offered shelter. Inside, Travis laid the baby down on an old blanket while Sarah collapsed onto a rickety chair. So what's the plan? He asked, pacing the room. We need to find help, Sarah said. Real help. But first, we need to keep him hidden. Travis looked at the baby, his heart tightening. What if they find us first? Sarah's eyes darkened. Then we fight. The words hung heavy in the air. Travis sat down beside the baby, his hand resting gently on its chest. I didn't ask for this, he muttered. But I'm not walking away. Sarah leaned forward. Neither am I. Outside, the forest was quiet, but Travis couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't stay that way for long. The cabin felt smaller as the night stretched on, its creaking walls amplifying the silence outside. Travis paced near the window, his eyes fixed on the dense tree line. Sarah sat against the far wall, her injured leg propped up and her breathing shallow. The baby, wrapped tightly in the blanket, slept soundly on the floor between them. You need to rest, Sarah said, her voice low but firm. Travis shook his head. I can't. Not with them out there. They don't know we're here, she insisted. Not yet. Travis didn't answer. Instead, he tightened his grip on the knife he'd found earlier, its blade catching the faint glow of the moonlight. He wanted to believe her, but the fresh footprint he'd seen earlier told him otherwise. Someone was tracking them. A faint noise outside made him freeze. A branch snapped, sharp and deliberate. Sarah sat up straighter. What was that? Travis motioned for her to stay quiet. He crept toward the door, easing it open just enough to peer outside. The forest was still, but the tension in the air was heavy, pressing against him like a weight. Another sound, a low, guttural whistle, cut through the quiet. Travis's stomach sank. It wasn't an animal. It was a signal. They're here, he whispered, stepping back and locking the door. Sarah's eyes widened. What do we do? Travis grabbed the baby and handed it to her. You stay with him. If anything happens, you run. Don't stop. And what about you? I'll buy you time. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but the sudden thud against the door silenced her. The wood groaned as if something heavy had slammed into it. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Travis held up his knife, positioning himself between them and the door. Another hit came, harder this time, rattling the hinges. They're trying to break it down, Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. Travis didn't respond. He couldn't. Every muscle in his body tensed as the door buckled under the strain. Then, with one final crack, it splintered inward. A man stepped through the opening. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried a rifle slung across his back. His eyes locked onto Travis, and a slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. Well, the man said. You've been busy. Travis gritted his teeth. Who are you? The man took another step forward, his boots crunching over broken wood. You already know the answer to that. Travis tightened his grip on the knife. Stay back. The man tilted his head, as if amused. Or what? You'll fight me? With that little blade? I will. The man's smile faded. "Hand over the baby, and I'll make this quick." "Not gonna happen." The man lunged. Travis sidestepped, swinging the knife toward him. The blade grazed the man's arm, drawing blood, but it wasn't enough to stop him. With one powerful strike, the man knocked Travis to the ground. Sarah screamed, clutching the baby tighter. Travis scrambled to his feet just as the man reached for her. Fueled by desperation, he drove the knife into the man's side. The attacker roared in pain, staggering back. "Go!" Travis shouted at Sarah. She hesitated for only a moment before bolting out the back door with the baby in her arms. Travis turned back to the man, who was already pulling the knife from his side. Blood stained his shirt, but his eyes burned with rage. "This isn't over," the man growled. "I know," Travis said, raising his fists. The man lunged again, and Travis braced himself. Travis's fists ached, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he dodged another swing. The man, Marcus, as Sarah had called him, was bleeding heavily, but he didn't slow down. If anything, the wound seemed to fuel his rage. "Where is she?" Marcus snarled, his eyes wild. Travis didn't answer. He lunged, catching Marcus off guard and slamming him into the splintered remains of the door. The force knocked the rifle loose from Marcus's back, and it clattered to the floor. Both men froze. Marcus dove for the weapon, but Travis was faster. He kicked it across the room, sending it skidding out of reach. Marcus roared in frustration and charged again, but this time Travis didn't back down. He tackled him, driving both of them to the ground. "Stay down," Travis growled, pinning him. But Marcus wasn't done. With a surge of strength, he shoved Travis off and staggered to his feet, his breathing heavy. "You think this is about you?" Marcus spat. "You're nothing. That baby, he's the only thing that matters. And you have no idea what you're dealing with." Travis wiped the blood from his lip. "Then tell me." Marcus laughed, a low, hollow sound. "You wouldn't believe me if I did." Before Travis could respond, a sudden hiss filled the room. Both men froze as the massive snake, the same one Travis had seen with the baby, slithered through the broken doorframe. Its scales gleamed in the dim light, and its eyes locked onto Marcus. "What the?" Marcus took a step back. The snake coiled, its body rippling with tension. Marcus turned to run, but the creature struck with lightning speed, wrapping itself around his legs and pulling him to the floor. He screamed, thrashing wildly, but the snake's grip tightened. Travis stared, frozen. The snake wasn't attacking, it was restraining. He didn't have time to process it. Instead, he grabbed the rifle and bolted out the back door, following the faint sound of Sarah's voice. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in on all sides. He ran, branches scratching his arms and face, until he spotted Sarah crouched near a cluster of rocks, the baby still bundled in her arms. "You okay?" he asked, panting. She nodded, her eyes wide. "What happened?" Travis shook his head. "The snake, it stopped him." Sarah's face paled. "It protected us." He glanced back toward the cabin, half expecting Marcus to burst through the trees, but the forest was silent. Sarah touched his arm. "We need to keep moving. There could be more of them." Travis hesitated, then nodded. They followed the riverbank, staying low and quiet. The baby remained calm, its tiny hands gripping Sarah's shirt as if sensing her fear. As they walked, Sarah explained more about the pendant and the people who had abandoned the baby. "They believe he's special," she said. "Chosen by the forest, or whatever force they worship. That snake was part of their rituals. It's supposed to protect him." Travis frowned. "But it didn't hurt me." "Maybe it knew," Sarah said softly. "Maybe it saw you trying to protect him." Travis didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything about this situation felt surreal, but the baby's safety was the only thing that mattered now. Hours passed, and the forest began to thin. Travis slowed, his instincts prickling. Something wasn't right. "Wait," he whispered, pulling Sarah behind a tree. Ahead, partially hidden by the undergrowth, was another figure. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying a machete, the man scanned the area, his movements deliberate. "They're still looking for him," Sarah whispered. Travis tightened his grip on the rifle. "Not for long." Travis's pulse pounded in his ears as he crouched lower behind the tree, gripping the rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. The man with the machete moved slowly, scanning the forest with sharp, predatory eyes. Sarah held the baby close, her breathing shallow. "What do we do?" she whispered. Travis didn't answer. He was already forming a plan, his mind racing. They couldn't outrun this guy, Sarah's leg was still in bad shape, and the baby couldn't handle another long trek. He had to end this. "Stay here," he whispered. Sarah's eyes widened. "What? No. You can't." "I have to," he interrupted. "If I don't, he'll find us anyway." Before she could argue, Travis slipped away, moving silently through the underbrush. His heart hammered, but his movements were steady. Years of surviving on instinct were finally paying off. The man stopped, turning his head slightly as if sensing Travis's approach. "Come out," the man called, his voice deep and cold. "No point in hiding." Travis froze. The man's eyes swept the area, but he hadn't seen him yet. "I know you have the baby," the man continued. "Give it to me, and I'll let you walk away." Travis's grip tightened on the rifle. He took another step closer, staying low. "I won't ask again," the man growled. Travis moved. He burst from the underbrush, raising the rifle and shouting, "Drop it." The man spun, startled, but didn't lower the machete. "Don't be stupid," Travis warned. "I don't want to do this, but I will." The man smirked. "You think you're the first one to point a gun at me?" Without warning, he lunged. Travis fired. The shot echoed through the forest, but the man didn't go down. The bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him sideways, but he recovered fast, too fast. Travis barely had time to react before the machete sliced toward him. He jumped back, but the blade caught his arm, tearing through his sleeve and drawing blood. He gritted his teeth and swung the rifle like a bat, catching the man in the ribs. The attacker staggered but didn't fall. "You're out of your depth," the man sneered. Travis's mind raced. He was losing blood, and the man was still standing. But then he heard it, the low, familiar hiss. The snake. It slithered into view, its massive body weaving through the underbrush. The man's eyes widened, and for the first time, Travis saw fear. "No," the man whispered, stepping back. "Not you." The snake struck. It coiled around the man's legs, pulling him down with terrifying speed. He screamed, thrashing and slicing at the snake with his machete, but it didn't let go. Travis didn't wait to see the rest. He turned and ran back to Sarah. "We have to go," he said, grabbing her arm. "What happened?" she asked, clutching the baby. "No time." They pushed forward, the sounds of the struggle fading behind them. Travis's arm throbbed, but he ignored it. All that mattered was getting Sarah and the baby to safety. After what felt like an eternity, the forest began to thin, and they stumbled out onto an old dirt road. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Travis waved frantically, stepping into the road. The vehicle slowed, a rusty pickup truck driven by an older man with a concerned expression. "Help us," Travis said, his voice hoarse. "Please." The man took one look at the blood and the baby and didn't ask questions. "Get in." Travis helped Sarah into the truck, then climbed in after her, the baby still nestled in her arms. As the truck rumbled down the road, Travis finally allowed himself to breathe. But even as the forest faded behind them, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. The truck rattled along the uneven dirt road, its headlights cutting through the lingering darkness. Travis slumped against the seat, his arm wrapped in a strip of cloth Sarah had torn from her shirt. The pain throbbed, but he barely noticed. His eyes stayed locked on the baby in Sarah's arms, its tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The driver, an older man named Hank, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "There's a ranger station about 10 miles ahead. They've got a radio. You can call for help." Travis exhaled slowly. For the first time since he'd stepped into the forest, safety felt within reach. But his thoughts wouldn't settle. Marcus's words echoed in his head. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. What if they find us?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Travis didn't answer right away. He looked down at the baby, the pendant peeking out from the folds of the blanket. "They won't," he said finally, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. Hank cleared his throat. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Travis exchanged a glance with Sarah. They had agreed not to tell Hank the whole story. Who would believe it? "Just some bad people after the kid," Travis said, keeping it vague. Hank nodded. "Well, whatever trouble you're in, we'll get you out of it. I've seen my share of bad folks. They don't last long out here." The words offered little comfort. The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry. Sarah rocked it gently, her eyes glistening. "You saved him," she said to Travis. He shook his head. "I didn't do it alone." The snake's image flashed in his mind, the way it had coiled around Marcus, protecting them in a way he couldn't explain. The road turned, and the ranger station came into view. A small wooden building with a radio antenna perched on the roof. Light poured from its windows, cutting through the early dawn. "We're here," Hank said, pulling to a stop. Travis climbed out first, scanning the area. No signs of movement. No shadows in the trees. They hurried inside. A young ranger behind the desk looked up, startled by the sight of them. "We need help," Sarah said quickly. The ranger grabbed the radio and called for backup. Within minutes, the room was filled with the buzz of activity, questions, medical supplies, and promises of safety. But Travis stayed near the window, staring out at the tree line. "You okay?" Sarah asked, stepping beside him. "I don't know," he admitted. "What if this isn't over?" Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "Maybe it's not. But we'll face it together." He looked at her, then at the baby, and something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, he felt grounded, like he had something worth fighting for. "Yeah," he said. "Together." The baby cooed softly, and Travis smiled. Outside, the forest loomed, its secrets hidden in the shadows. But Travis wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready.